Thank you all for coming on this kind of wonderfully spring afternoon. My name is Toby Dodge, and I label under the august title Senior Consulting Fellow for the Middle East. But much more importantly, we have Dr. Nelly El-Hood, who is the recently appointed Senior Fellow for Political Islamism at the International Institute for Strategic Studies Middle East Office. Nelly has a PhD from the Australian National University, after which she became a postdoctoral scholar at St John's College, Cambridge, then a research fellow at the Belfast Centre for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, and before joining us, she was an associate professor in the Department of Social Sciences at the US Military Academy at West Point, and I think much more apposite for what she's going to say now, she was a senior associate at the Combating Terrorism Centre, also at West Point for 5 years. Her first big book, the first of many, published by Columbia University Press, is The Jihadist Path to Self-Destruction, but also while she was at the Combating Terrorism Centre, she was either the lead author or a joint author on 2 or 3 seminal works, both on Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So she will talk to us for about half an hour.
This afternoon I'm going to draw on some of the research that I've done in the past, as well as on ongoing research and future ones that I plan to conduct. So this is an opportunity also for me to get some feedback from you about the future research as part of the IISS program on political Islamism. I come to the field of jihadi studies from a background in political theory and Islamic studies. And during my teaching and research at West Point the past 5.5 years, before joining IISS, I benefited from an extensive education, mainly through teaching, in terrorism and counterterrorism analysis, which I now incorporate in my research. So in analyzing the evolution of jihadism through the lens of the academic fields that I've studied, I want to devote my presentation to 2 themes. The first is the political paradigm or framework within which the jihadis operate. And here I want to look at its strengths and its weaknesses. The second is how this paradigm is driving the divides among jihadis today, and what these divides and divisions might mean when viewed from a CT perspective. So starting with the strengths and weaknesses of the political framework that governs jihadism, I think the best starting point is one that's exemplified by the contested standing of the Islamic State in the jihadi world. In June 2014, and in a statement entitled "This is God's Promise," Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, the spokesman of the jihadi Iraq-based group at the time, proclaimed the establishment of a global Islamic State, as he called it, announced that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was elected to the office of caliph, and established al-Baghdadi's lineage to the Prophet Muhammad's Quraysh tribe, since a Qurashi descent is a necessary criterion to qualify for the office of caliph, according to most classical Sunni scholars. So when al-Baghdadi accepted his election to caliph, he saw himself to be delivering on the promise towards which jihadis have been fighting for decades, namely the establishment of a caliphate, or a universal Islamic state that would unite Muslims worldwide. Of course, it's not surprised that mainstream Muslims did not entertain the thought of embracing the caliphate. But it should be noteworthy that not all jihadis welcomed the news, and some deemed the declaration to be preposterous, not least Al-Qaeda, the group that once preoccupied the attention of the counterterrorism community. So if establishing an Islamic state where God's law reigns supreme is the goal of jihadism, why should the proclamation of a caliphate not win the approval of all jihadis? A key reason for this is related to the fact that the ideological universe of jihadism is premised on a religious paradigm that is not conducive to compromise, let alone unity. I want to highlight here that when I point to an Islamic religious paradigm underpinning jihadi ideology, I am not inferring a causal relationship here between Islam and violence. Islam, like many other religions, can indeed play a role in radicalizing people and also to justify violence. But it is important to be mindful of how and why some teachings of a religious tradition matter, and even more importantly, why some teachings of the same religious tradition do not matter. So what then are some of the elements that do matter in jihadism and why. The engine that launched and sustained jihadism until the proclamation of a global Islamic State was the jihadis' appropriation of the classical legal theory of defensive jihad. Allow me to bore you a little bit. The law of warfare in Islam is not laid down in the Quran. It was developed by classical jurists. Like Christian jurists who developed the theory of holy war, Muslim jurists envisaged two types of warfare. One is offensive, the other is defensive. Offensive warfare entailed many stipulations, including being waged by a legitimate ruler, whereas defensive jihad was defined as a call to arm, designed to take effect when Islamic territory is invaded. Under such circumstances, jihad becomes an individual obligation. The technical Arabic word is fard ayn, incumbent upon every Muslim, regardless of age, gender, or financial circumstances. In other words, the individual is not restrained by any authority to exercise violence on his own. Even more, it is obligatory for the believer to take up jihad to defend the land where Islam is sovereign. These were the rules of engagement in the pre-modern era. Muslim majority states today are members of the United Nations and are bound by international law. And in modern legal parlance, the law of jihad as a military doctrine is no more part of a Muslim's religion than holy war is part of a Christian's articles of faith. International law does not admit of the right to wage either holy war or jihad. But the law of jihad is central to jihadi ideology, because the jihadis are not trying to build a state that is part of the community of nations. All jihadi groups, despite their differences, including the Islamic State, none of them has aspirations to become members of the United Nations. So for those who tell me, let's give them a state and see what they do, they don't want it. They don't want the state. Instead, the jihadis want to repeat Islam's military successes through jihad in the pre-modern period. In their minds, if they commit to jihad as the early Muslims did, God would grant them the same success he granted their ancestors. Through jihad in God's path, they hold, they would ultimately establish a global, invincible state or caliphate whose legitimacy is premised on God's law. Unlike the modern state, which the jihadis consider to be illegitimate and unjust because it is premised on positive law, the divine legitimacy of their state, they argue, would deliver what man-made law cannot, namely true justice. Accordingly, the religious paradigm within which jihadis frame their worldview is necessarily outside positive law or secular law and cannot recognize the legitimacy of any of the political processes concomitant with it, such as the formation of political parties or contesting elections. So the outright rejection of positive law has been both a source of strength and weakness for the jihadis. On the one hand, this rejection asserts jihadism's claim to a global project, thereby it enables them to utilize religion in the service of transcending the exclusive borders of the modern state to mobilize Muslims as well as converts to take up jihad against the world order. In the jihadi universe, belonging is not premised on acquiring a citizenship of a state. It's much easier, but on a brotherhood or sisterhood through the loyalty to and love of God. The jihadis draw on the religious concepts of wala and bara to define the parameters of loyalty. Wala refers to the loyalty jihadis must have towards those who, like them, love God's friends and hate his enemies. Bara, by contrast, refers to those from whom jihadis must dissociate because they have compromised God's law. In principle, these parameters provide jihadis with a global contract. We speak of the social contract as states. For them, that serves them as a global contract that is inclusive of Muslims and converts from anywhere, East and West. And it also protects the jihadi project by excluding not just the infidels, more importantly, by excluding Muslims who are not committed to the same principles. Also importantly, by rejecting the legitimacy of the modern state, jihadis are not bound to conform to the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force, and therefore the legitimacy of their jihad is not bound by this monopoly. On the other hand, by asserting that jihadism is irreconcilable with positive law, religious legitimacy is bent in favor of those who are closest to the literal interpretation of scriptures, putting literalism ahead of strategic considerations that may benefit the community. This tension has been divisive within jihadism because some jihadis are disposed to pragmatism, others are not. Those who seek a religious solution for what they consider to be intractable political problems tend to be more pragmatic and want to avoid extremism in interpreting religious texts. Al-Qaeda falls under this realm. So for those pragmatic, they emphasize the value of wala, in other words, to expand the pool of jihadis. However, those for whom religious commitment is conditioned by a sectarian disposition stress the value of bara to purify the group from any perceived infidelity. For some, bara is not even sufficient, and they resort to what is called takfir, which is to declare fellow Muslims to be unbelievers, a pronouncement that, according to some classical legal scholars, makes it lawful to shed the blood of the accused. In Islamic, including jihadi parlance, takfir represents extremism that serves to divide rather than unite Muslims, and it is to be avoided. However, for the most part, those who make takfir pronouncements do not consider themselves to be extremists. Rather, they consider it to be the last but necessary resort. So, this catch-22 aspect to the jihadi paradigm has given an unpredictable edge to global jihadism, and it has not always served the objectives of all jihadi groups. Two key consequences have resulted. The first has to do with disunity amongst jihadis in relation to their activities. The second concerns infighting amongst jihadis. On the level of activities, jihadi activities have not always been coordinated or authorized by the groups in whose names jihadi operations were mounted. In recent years, I've not just focused on the ideological drivers of jihadism, but I've immersed myself in reading internal documents to Al-Qaeda, and I came to appreciate how ideological differences translate on the operational level. One of the most illuminating documents about the internal dynamics of Al-Qaeda as an organization is an 1156-page autobiography by Fadl Haroun, who was killed in 2011. He was an Al-Qaeda operative and instrumental in the planning of the 1998 East Africa bombings. Through his lens, one gets to see the divide between Al-Qaeda and other jihadi groups. He considers the generation, as he calls them, of fanatical jihadis who act in the name of Al-Qaeda but do not follow its ideology as the jihadis.com. He holds that the original Al-Qaeda, by which he means the organization that was under the leadership of bin Laden, should be distinguished from regional jihadi groups acting in its name. He insists that most of the attacks mounted by jihadis following the 9/11 attacks, and I'm quoting him, lack the authorization of Sheikh Osama or the central leadership of Al-Qaeda. Haroun's account is corroborated by declassified private communications between Al-Qaeda leaders. One of the declassified letters authored by a certain Sheikh Yunus and addressed to bin Laden and captured in his Abbottabad compound warns of fanatical brothers who claim affiliation with Al-Qaeda but are a liability to its strategy. Bin Laden himself was equally alarmed. Some of his declassified letters reveal the concerns that he had, and I'm quoting him, the mistakes of the jihadis that distorted the image of jihadism in the eyes of the Ummah's general public and separated them from their popular bases. And as jihadi groups got weaker or were prevented from mounting sophisticated operations, unaffiliated jihadis, inspired by either jihadi groups or ideologues, have taken up the torch of jihad on an individual basis. And we saw this, for example, in attacks like the Fort Hood attacks in 2009, the Boston Marathon of 2013, as well as the Charlie Hebdo bombings in 2015. Declassified documents also reveal that the proclamation of the Islamic State in Iraq back in 2006 was taken, I'm quoting, without consultation with Al-Qaeda's leadership, and this ill-considered innovation led to divisions among jihadis and their supporters inside and outside Iraq. On the level of infighting among jihadis, since believers have an individual obligation to take up jihad and defend the faith, doctrinal disagreements have served as a recipe for bloody divisions or sedition. The public dispute between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State is not unique to jihadism. Harun, the same whom I quoted earlier, describes that back in Peshawar, the place that welcomed jihadis to fight against the Soviets, was also a place that was lit with internal strife and divisive and destructive ideas. Many zealots, he relates, did not hesitate to declare takfir against fellow Muslims, lamenting that the takfiris were obsessed with rejecting the religious credentials of jihadi leaders, including bin Laden. He claims that in 1992, two takfiris attempted to assassinate two Al-Qaeda leaders, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri and Abu Hafs al-Musri, and others even attempted to assassinate bin Laden in Sudan in 1994. Other writings by jihadi ideologues suggest that some jihadis refused to fight alongside the Taliban, deeming some of their religious practices, such as performing prayer at a cemetery, as a form of association with God's divinity, and therefore accused them of kufr or unbelief. Differences are more apparent today, not because they did not exist before, but because jihadis have expanded geographically. This, combined with the more developed media resources to which they avail themselves, we are able to monitor their disunity more so than ever. There is a plethora of disagreements that are being voiced, but the key one concerns whether the caliphate that was proclaimed in June 2014 is a legitimate political entity, and by consequence, whether its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is a lawful caliph. Since resorting to elections to determine the Islamic State's legal standing is not a lawful option, according to jihadi ideology, the dispute can only be argued on the basis of Islamic law. When understood at face value and without due attention to context, religious law, any religious law, is bound to favor the zealots. Thus, since all jihadis believe themselves to be fighting to make God's law reign supreme, those favoring the establishment of an Islamic State are less likely to be accused of shirking their religious duties than those who wish to postpone it for pragmatic reasons. The dispute over the caliphate has deeper historical roots and explains the split between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. One of the founding documents of Al-Qaeda, going back to the late 1980s, reveals the centrality of jihad to the group's identity and its broader mission, but it also shows the group's pragmatic attitudes towards other non-militant religious duties. Let me quote aspects of this document. Al-Qaeda is an Islamic group and jihad is its path. Jihad is the principal reason that members have joined this group to carry out, together with observing various other Islamic duties insofar as it is possible. When jihad and other religious duties are in conflict, members of Al-Qaeda are expected to give priority to the duty of jihad ahead of other duties. End of quotation. The objective of establishing a state is assumed, but it is not one that Al-Qaeda wanted to invest in. Most likely, its leaders feared that building a state may force them to resort to the injustices of the states that they sought to destroy. When in 2010, the jihadi group in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, wanted to declare a state and sought consultation, an Al-Qaeda leader firmly responded, and I'm quoting, "Of course we want an Islamic state in which we would establish God's law, but only if we are capable of holding on to it." End of quotation. It is not wise, he added, to burden the people with pressures that they cannot handle, for that would cause major consequences. By contrast, since at least 1999, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who was killed in 2006, the founder of the Iraq-based group that developed into the Islamic State, was intent on building what he called at the beginning a complete social structure, the embryo of a state. He even contemplated launching his project from Mosul, hoping to replicate the 12th century campaign of the military commander Nuruddin al-Zanqi, who led the movement to liberate Jerusalem, and that Saladin later completed. Al-Zarqawi's immediate successor, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, who was killed in 2010, was the one who actually declared the Islamic State back in 2006. And in 2014, his successor, the current leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, delivered Mosul and more territories. Now, why should this group that has outdid all other, that managed to outdo all other jihadi groups, why should it be denied the legitimacy of this caliphate? Well, its supporters, of course, believe that it deserves to be considered to be legitimate, citing Quranic verses and legal texts that argue that establishing a caliphate is a religious obligation. Its jihadi enemies, including Al-Qaeda, think otherwise. They contend that it is not an obligation unless it has adequate strength, or tamkeen, that would enable Muslims to hold on to it and administer the hudud, or deterrent penalties for crimes. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader of Al-Qaeda, is adamant that it is not, I'm quoting him, established on the prophetic model, and we consider it to be an emirate, not a state, that came to be through usurpation and without consultation. Therefore, it does not meet the requirements that would make it necessary for Muslims to pledge allegiance to it, and we do not consider Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi fit for the office of caliph. End of quotation. So what does this all mean for the future of jihadism? Notwithstanding the threat that jihadism poses to global security, its evolution has shown that its weakness lies within. But although jihadism is not destined to be successful, it is likely to feature more extremism and internal splits in the future. Just as Al-Qaeda's rejection of positive law has allowed others to eclipse its claim to religious authenticity and has seen its influence gradually wane, the same fate may similarly await the Islamic State. For the rejection of positive law has limited the jihadis' ability to reach compromises, leaving them with a religious paradigm that by itself necessarily favors literalism. They will either break away, like the Islamic State did, and pursue a path of more extremism to prove their religious credentials until another group in their midst decides that even more extremism is needed, or maintain religious pragmatism like Al-Qaeda did and risk being marginalized and reduced to issuing public statements. So let me now conclude on some of the ideas that I'm currently pursuing in my research in terms of how I see the jihadi field moving from my research interest. Since the field forewarns of more extremism, I'm interested in pursuing how sectarianism is going to evolve. Sectarianism has been around for a long time in the jihadi ideology, but the success of the Islamic State the past couple of years, and despite its setbacks, has propelled sectarianism to the forefront of jihadism. We are seeing sectarianism more instrumental than in previous times. In addition to this, and possibly related to it, I'm eager to learn more about how the Islamic State's jihadism is going to navigate tribalism, particularly in the Gulf region. Al-Qaeda found it difficult to navigate the complex systems of clans and tribes in Somalia, Yemen, and elsewhere. Now, one of the Islamic State's influential ideologues is Turki ibn Ali, who comes from a prominent tribe in Bahrain. And some of my new Bahraini colleagues have been educating me about the importance of Ben Ali's tribal connection and what this could mean in terms of his potential to radicalize some young people and perhaps break the barrier between jihadism and resilient tribal structure. In addition, I'm also interested in studying the evolution of the Islamic State, not just through the lens of the jihadi enterprise, but as a state-building project. The group declared itself in a state in 2006. The jihadologist in me wants to follow its jihadi credentials, but the political theorist in me is also keen to explore what it means to launch a startup state in the modern era and in the age of social media. And related to this, I'm interested in exploring the Islamic State's performative violence, to borrow Foucault's parlance, the return of torture as a public spectacle. More specifically, whether we've been witnessing performative violence as a state-building exercise, or whether we've been witnessing state-building as a tool of terrorism. If it is the latter, we may see other groups replicating what the Islamic State did. All right, thank you.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. As I said at the beginning, Nellie has kindly allowed us half an hour to pepper her with questions. So who would like to start? Dr. Redmond in the second to last row, please.
Thank you. Nellie, thank you very much. Nicholas Redmond at IISS. Actually, my question relates to your final point
And it's a question that I suspect our chair is going to weigh in on and say I'm completely wrong, but at least let me put it out first, which is when you look at Islamic State, one thing I've pondered in the past few days is what is the correct historical parallel for it? And the one that I landed upon was actually Lenin's Russia circa 1920, a revolutionary state completely overturning the status quo at home, aggressive, territorially expansive towards its immediate neighbors, both through subversion and also force of arms, but also having a revolutionary ideology that reaches much further abroad and looks to subvert and also attract disciples almost to come to the homeland, but also to work abroad. I realize there are limits to that, but just wonder, do you have any response to that? Do you think there's a better historical parallel?
I think there are more historical parallels. I mean, the foundations of states, when I read Machiavelli or the history of Rome, or I think the ideas of what we've seen from the Islamic State in terms of the public spectacle of the violence and the aggressivity, ultimately that's what in history states do. This is how they're founded. Hobbes really says it all in the title of Leviathan. The state is a monster, and violence is part of the DNA of the state. What I think we're seeing, what is different for us at the moment is that for a long time, our modern sensitivities have been accustomed to new states becoming part of the community of nations as independence movements, as they're fighting the oppressive, or they're wanting to have their own nationalism and so on, and of course violence occurs and so on, but they didn't really display it on YouTube. So there is an element here that is very confronting and very real about what the Islamic State wants to show us, the reality of what it means to build a state, to construct a state, and they're doing it on YouTube. There's a difference between reading it in Machiavelli and the history of Rome and so on. I don't think that it is. Communism is, and the revolutionary aspect of communism, I think, is important, is an important analogy. But the same, I think, I would find communism a little bit different from a religious ideology. It can be, they can both be revolutionary, but I think there's more room to negotiate with communism, and pragmatism is a possibility that could evolve out of communism, and it did. I can't see it evolving out of jihadism, if that makes sense.
I just want to pick up on your discussion, both of Foucault and of state building. Foucault talks about the move from wholesale theatrical violence to retail targeted violence as the move to the modern state. And it strikes me that the Islamic State aren't doing that. They're doing almost the reverse. They're doing what Foucault would describe as almost pre-modern, a kind of theatrical display, which Cleavis, to jump to another theorist completely would argue is almost a marker of kind of bludgeoning weakness.
You're absolutely right. No,
But just
sure.
to go on, but from that point of view, what fascinates me about the Islamic State, and I think you were hinting that it was ideological. So Zarqawi and his predecessor form a return address for the Mail, as it were, in 2006, and get absolutely hammered and defeated in 2007 because they're out there in the open, as it were. And then they do it again in 2014. So they're then almost not learning, or at least they're not taking the lessons I would have thought they should rationally have taken. So what is it about holding territory and building states? Why do they do it, I would have thought? And,
So on the issue of Foucault, you're absolutely right. He he does say in Discipline and Punish, the disappearance, he talks about the disappearance of a public spectacle, of torture as a public spectacle. So but it was his language, his parlance that I was borrowing. I am now saying the return of it through the Islamic State. So definitely that's not what Foucault thinks. But why is there a return? This is actually very interesting for me, and very interesting because I want to see, are they really building a state, or are they using the state as a means of terrorism? And this is where I think, is this and is this really being enabled by the social media and so on? In terms of the territory and why are they doing it? So some of the captured battlefield documents from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, we see internal documents really concerned about the declaration of the state in 2006, as you noted, and they say that we've become, the Americans, or the U.S. forces, referring to the Americans, they became the people who are active and powerful on the ground, and we had to flee to the desert because it became a state without any substance to it. I think why they did it, the opportunity arose. I think they've been wanting to rebel against Al-Qaeda for a very long time. I think the declaration of a state was a divorce in 2006. It was a public divorce from Al-Qaeda. We know that there have some leaked documents at the time between Al-Qaeda's leaders and Zarqawi, but the internal documents that were declassified later, the kind of language that we see Al-Qaeda's leaders using against the leaders of the Islamic State, of Iraq at the time, really they show complete disdain. The Abbottabad letters, some of them they refer to. I wrote to them and rebuked them. One Al-Qaeda leader says they lack wisdom. They're dangerous, appalling. So these guys have been really active in Iraq, and nothing they have ever done that met or seemed to have pleased the Al-Qaeda's leadership. So there were two opportunities that arose. Firstly, the fact that jihadis mostly, including Al-Qaeda, during the Arab Spring, the initial phase of the Arab Spring, were spectators. The Arab Spring took them by surprise. So they were sidelined by the Arab Spring. And the only way that the jihadis made their presence felt in the Arab Spring is through Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. That was the first jihadi group that entered the scene in Syria. And logistically, they had been actually supported by the Islamic State of Iraq. But they didn't want to continue that connection with them. So April 2013, when al-Baghdadi declared the merger, or imposed the merger, between the Islamic State of Iraq and Jabhat al-Nusra, it came as a surprise to the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra. But that was really a coup against Al-Qaeda. Why they did it? I think they were part of accidents as well as design. Yes, they wanted the state. They've declared it a long time ago. And the accidents that really happened, whether it's in Iraq and in Syria, enabled them and to get some territories. And they grabbed onto the opportunity. But it was largely accidental.
Fascinating. A forest of hands. I'll take Nigel first, then I'll work my way around.
Yeah. Thanks, Nigel Thanks to double S. I think it's fair to say, is it not, that before the arrival of Islamic State in its current form, Al-Qaeda leadership were starting to show themselves much more responsive to and concerned about allegations that the only people Al-Qaeda had really been killing in recent years were fellow Muslims. And there seemed to be a lot of thought given to how to mitigate the impact, the public relations impact of this perception, but also to actually rein in some of the more gratuitous violence. With the advent of Islamic State, we've seen the bar set at almost unprecedented levels in terms of the kind of violence and barbarity that had been used, and it seems to be straight out of the management of savagery playbook. almost as if they'd taken that book, read it, and decided to kind of implement it more or less wholesale. Do you think that if Islamic State does kind of run out of steam and Al-Qaeda does manage to regain some of its lost, its former prominence, that it will be actually possible to get this genie back into the bottle? Or, you know, can we simply expect a progressive ratcheting up of the barbarism that we've witnessed in northern Iraq and Syria in the last couple of years?
This depends on where. It seems that that there's a different strength in different regions for Al-Qaeda. It seems in the Afghanistan and Pakistan area, they've declared in September 2014, they declared the Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. It has carried out some operations, but really not much has come out. The Islamic State went on and competed there and established its own province of Khorasan. In terms of the barbarism and the extremism, I mean, I suspect, you know, I can't see it. I mean, I think terrorist groups need to establish themselves through more extremism. In order to eclipse other groups, they really need to outbid each other. So this is really what happened between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So this process of outbidding is really they're going to have to be more original or creative. If the future of jihadism is going to come out of Libya, or is going to come out of Nigeria with Boko Haram, or if we see the Islamic State starting to lose more and more territories in Iraq and Syria, and to continue its descent, who is going to fill the vacuum, and how they're going to prove their credentials? They're going to prove their credentials through more violence. So I hope that I'm wrong, but I suspect this is going to be the strategy. You know, we saw this in terms of people, scholars in terrorism studies talk about why, for example, suicide bombing is a strategy. Mia Bloom, one of the great scholars who actually said that suicide terrorism is an outbidding strategy. This is how terrorist groups outbid each other. They need to go from one extreme to the other.
Yes, you, sir.
My name's Harry Johnston. I'm a consultant with IISS, working on Mali, the Sahel, Libya. I just wanted to know if you could share a few thoughts on the evolution of counterterrorism based on the context of some of the things you've been discussing. Would you be able to share any thoughts on, you know, what you think needs to happen among counter-terrorist entities to try to understand and contain some of the developments that are taking place? That's the first question. The second is if you could just touch a bit more on developments in the North Africa region as you see them.
So as far as the counterterrorism strategies, as somebody who reads text and analyzes them, I've been, and I tend to immerse myself with what the militant groups themselves say. What was troubling for me in the counterterrorism world is the focus that up until recently they saw the world be through the lens of Al-Qaeda. They analyzed jihadism as if Al-Qaeda was in control. Every group that acted wherever it was, so long as it said jihadism, that was, you know, Al-Qaeda central, Bin Laden, or later Al-Zawahiri, and so on. What they failed to do, they saw connections. What they didn't really focus on are actually the differences, because the differences are really what tell us how jihadi groups or how militant groups might move next. So I think it's probably simpler to look at connections, because of course you'll find connections, you'll find the same language, similarities of discourse, of rhetoric. But what is much more compelling and what requires more effort is really to look at how these groups are differing with each other. And this is what causes them actually to become more violent and more extremist. It's these differences that drives them. So for a very long time, the counterterrorism world was dominated by the franchising of Al-Qaeda as if everything was part of a connected realm, when in fact what was happening is actually the reverse. They spoke of Al-Qaeda affiliates where actually it was the non-affiliated part. And if you read what's, so I pay attention, for example, even now, what I'm interested in, Boko Haram is supposed to be part of a province of the Islamic State. And yet for weeks, I haven't seen any reference in the Islamic State's official publications about Boko Haram's operations. Why? Is there something happening? These are the things that we need to be paying attention to in terms of not the connection, but some of the things that could possibly be going on in terms of the internal dynamics. What would be the future of Al-Qaeda? How, for example, we were talking yesterday. I'm interested in the fact that the successor of Mullah Omar, who actually have been receiving various pledges of allegiance to recognize his legitimacy. I've been going through the Arabic website of the Taliban, and despite having actually advertised all these various people who have sent their pledges of allegiance, they've not acknowledged that al-Zawahiri has actually pledged allegiance to the leader of the Taliban. What does this mean? And yet al-Zawahiri doesn't miss a chance but to pledge his commitment and so on to the leader of the Taliban. And I suspect from the Taliban's case, it's unrequited love. So these are the more interesting things that I think the CT community needs to be looking at, and it's the differences that are more interesting.
Lady on the back row, thanks.
Joanna Cook at King's College London. From your perspective, how has the resurgence of Salafism more broadly in the region been impacting Salafi jihadists like those in IS? And is there an active way to separate and differentiate the two that might help isolate IS more if we continue to see Salafism's influence in the region growing? Thank you.
I generally avoid using the term Salafism myself because it could mean many things, and you'll find people who are if we mean by Salafism conservative religious thinking, I think that's that makes more sense. But I think what I'm interested in this is something that I hinted at the end of my presentation. It's not so much the conservative aspect that concerns me, is more in the region. It's more the tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and how this is actually enabling sectarianism. Because I think the vulnerability now is sectarianism, and what is playing out on the broader level, those tensions are somehow facilitating in some circles that sectarianism that's showing its ugly head.
Right, I have two questions down on the front row, thanks. The gentleman without the tie first, and then the gentleman with the tie.
Without the tie first. Going back to the sort of the tension between literalism and strategic thinking, Al-Qaeda versus ISIL. I'm trying to think whether there is that tension given the success of ISIL. Is it a tension, or is it actually the two reinforce each other? In terms of recruitment, it seems like if you only have literalism and the force of violence and all the rest of it, there's so much you can go. But if you want to deepen and prolong the impact of what you get with the literalism, you would need some strategy, and they seem to have it. So who is orchestrating this structure? And is there, even if literalism is at the core of it, which I'm sure it is there actually is there an interpretive group in the governance structure that actually tells Baghdadi what literalism is, what literalism implies in terms of action? How is their governance structure functioning with respect to these learned people who interpret?
You're right. It's there is a convenience also at play. My point about literalism and the rigidity is that on certain points, if you think at certain points when you are when you're not going to be pragmatic, and if you really want to favor a specific stance, it's very difficult to argue against establishing an Islamic State. You don't need to be al-Zawahiri, any observing Muslim, just to say, why is it wrong to have an Islamic State? If you want to push that, I mean, of course, Islamic law, if you want to apply it from a literalist perspective, it's going to favor extremism. That's where. So on some points, you'll find that they are that they want to make sure that literalism is there. Now, on other issues, yes, there is certain aspects that are intriguing me. For example, I read an article a few weeks ago, supposedly by a woman, who is writing a letter in public to her husband who's gone to Germany, and she's convincing him why she made the decision to go and live under the Islamic State and so on. And at the end of that letter, she says, I am, and yes, I'm going to confess that I traveled by myself. Now, under Islamic law, a woman is not allowed to travel by herself without a mahram or a male who is a relative of her. And she makes that. Now, I've not seen any outrage on this. So why isn't there an outrage? So in some ways, actually, if you really want to divide people in the Islamic State, the best way is actually to be even more extremist than they are. And you can. It's easier. I mean, so for instance, there are on certain occasions, the caliph decided to show mercy against some people who were captured later. Why was that? He shouldn't be allowed, right? So you can, if you want to have some groups who can be literal, they can be more literal than the Islamic State if they want to. And in fact, this is how you can actually divide people within, this is how you could make it weaker. But I guess what is lacking here is the spirit of the law, that they are being offensive at, and this is, and I'm normally very cold in my analysis, and I don't take offense. But there was at one point they released this document justifying, raping captive women and so on and so forth, and they use Islamic law to justify it, and it's all there in Islamic law, except that when the legal jurists actually formulated these laws, they were actually the avant-garde in terms of coming up with law that protects women in war. So, for instance, if Muslims were to get women as part of the spoils of war, they needed, for example, to wait a certain period until they find out whether the woman was already pregnant or not, and then after which they can lay with her. And if she becomes, for example, pregnant, she becomes walad, which means that she is entitled to some properties and to inheritance. So if you think about this in the 8th and 9th century, this was actually the avant-garde in terms of coming up with some legal procedures to provide women in war with some kind of rights. Yes, it defends our modern sensitivities, but at the time it was impressive. Now they are using it and putting it in the context of the 21st century to say how you can actually go about it, and here's the legal text that you could use. So literalism is taking some interesting features. At times, it's convenience as well.
The question mentioned, is there almost like a star chamber of interpreters in Raqqa or Mosul, do we know, that then deliver their judgment, or is it a more ad hoc? Abu Bakr wakes up one day and decides this is it. Is there a core or coherence?
There are several people who write, but it's not known.
Yeah,
it is not known. It is not known. I mean, as part of their public statements, you can go back to his predecessor, Abu Umar, in terms of some of his public statements, what we stand for, what our creed is, and so on and so forth, and you can build on that. So it's there. But you also have, for example, when they burnt the Jordanian pilot, for instance, other pundits came up and searched on a number of texts from the Islamic tradition where, it was done by Muslims to burn somebody, which makes it lawful. So you've got some energy being invested in terms of this, but these could be pundits. They're not necessarily part of the apparatus, but it is not really. It's not very clear how decisions are being made on the inside, in terms of the organizational level.
Sure.
Thank you very much indeed. I have two questions. The first question is related to heating. Is there any direct relationship between ideas and practice, or if I may, those elements that you have mentioned in your speech was part of the strategic narratives that has been developed by Daesh and all jihadist groups, and is there any relationship between these strategic narratives and their behaviors, or there is something you can say profound or that lead them or to motivate them in order to do their practices and behavior? And also, it was very interesting for me that you have mentioned tribalism. And is there, suppose that there is, one of the scholars has mentioned that belief, tribe, and tribute, these three elements are the underpinning components of any jihadist group or any extremist group which goes to the era of the Prophet Muhammad?
Well, we'll just collect all the questions because we're coming to the end. Brigadier Barry.
Yeah, I'm from the ISS. To continue the point Nick Redmond made, I wonder if another way of looking at what has happened with the Islamic State is 20th century revolutionary guerrilla warfare theory, which envisaged that, if you like, the guerrilla and the terrorist forces would carve out liberated areas from which conventional forces would also attack the enemy, because much of what's happened, I think, it fits that model. But can I just make some observations on IS as a state?
Well, you better be quick because we've got 4 minutes left.
Okay. What I'd say is, first of all, the state gives them revenue, and that's quite useful for an organisation like IS. The second thing is much of the behaviour we've seen from IS has been very 21st century, and I wonder if in the people who are making this thing work, there's enough understanding of the 21st century not to reject what is positive about 21st century states.
Excellent. Right. Who else before we... Yes, you, sir.
Thank you for the presentation. Allow me, because you asked for it, to problematize the reference to Foucault and the theatrics of violence. That is nothing but a reflection itself on the particular basis of a particular order in not pre-modern modernity but early modernity. This reflects that sovereignty is vested in the body of the king. And if you violate the law, violate sovereignty, you violate the body of the king, and therefore the punishment will be executed on your body publicly, so you're not doing this. Now, real quick question, is there something similar to that secularized sovereign that this is the basis for this political order in the political order that you are investigating? This feeds, of course, into the question, do our Western concepts of political order actually apply in this particular case, and how far you can stretch this?
Anyone else? Yes, there you go.
Hi, Hervé Lamieux from the Institute. Just a quick question. I mean, you seem to suggest that there's an endless spiral towards greater forms of violence, but at some point there just must be an expiry on the political legitimacy you can extract from greater and greater acts of violence. Because, as you say, I mean, exerting mercy is also a form of exerting political legitimacy. And I'm just wondering whether the endless forms of resorting towards greater forms of violence plus splintering, in the end, isn't the best counter-terrorist strategy out there. Let it implode. Let the movement run out of steam. Let it fall on its own contradictions. Is that the sort of somewhat more positive reading of of the evolution of jihadism, or do you just see things getting worse?
Right. On my count, you have 6 questions, and we'll give you 5 minutes to answer all of them. The relationship between ideas and practice, narrative and behavior. Tribalism, belief and tribute underpinning this. Is it guerrilla warfare, 20th century guerrilla warfare revisited, liberated areas, etc.? The state gives us revenue, and the fighters are really 21st century or will refuse to reject the 21st century. The perils of using Foucault anywhere, especially in Europe.
I'm going to regret that.
And then the endless spiral of violence. Surely that must end. Where's the legitimacy in that?
Okay, can I start with the last one because it's my favorite? Actually, it is my favorite because I do believe that they are destined to self-destruct. And that was, before I started, learning more about terrorism studies, and I was just looking at the textual analysis and so on. And I saw that the ideology is only destined, really, and that's why the title of the book that I wrote before was The Jihadi's Path to Self-Destruction. This is how I saw it. What I didn't say is that how long was the path. And this is where the tricky part is. The problem is if they are not being constrained in one area. If they are constrained in one area, it would be easier. But their ability to be global, it's making that path much longer. And I do agree with you that they're not. But since they are on the path of extremism, and because they are really bound with a paradigm that does not allow them to be flexible. Like the Islamists, for example, who actually form political parties and contest elections and use Islamic teachings, they're very pragmatic. They will endure and so on. But with these groups, they don't have the option to resort to positive law. If you read Ayman al-Zawahiri at the moment, and he would love to have elections, but he can't. You can tell from his statements that he is yearning for elections, but he can't make that argument. He's stuck with that paradigm. With respect to strategic narratives and tribalism, the strategic narratives, I think I didn't give the jihadis their due kind of what they deserve, because jihadism emerged not simply as a religious movement. They started because of political, because what they saw as a political stalemate. The reform was not an option. They saw for a very long time that governments in Muslim majority states were actually autocratic, and there was no way that they could bring about democratic reform and so on. The very first entrance into jihadism is really through bringing down Islamic states. So they assassinated a Muslim ruler in Egypt. the author of the book was The Neglected Duty of Jihad, Muhammad Abdus Salam Faraj. He's really the author of that engine of defensive jihad, where he thought that it was an obligation to bring down the near enemy, which is really Muslim rulers who are not ruling according to Islamic teachings of social justice. So that's on the strategic. There is an element of strategic narratives. It's not just about pure doctrine. On the question of tribalism is very difficult for jihadis because jihadism ultimately is a very egalitarian creed. You don't want to play by the rules of the tribe. This is about bringing, and the Quran brought it was very revolutionary, and one of the most compelling thing about Quranic teachings is really because it sides with the underdog, it sides with the oppressed and so on. So it does have this element of egalitarianism to it, and it doesn't want to treat people differently in terms of whether they're tribe or not. It is really the Quranic verse, believers are brothers in religion. So that, pardon? It is even the Quran. That's right. It was that was not the Quran. It was decided that it was actually they have to come from the tribe from the Quraysh tribe. But that was because the second caliph made that decision. It was he wanted Umar at the time. I can go on. He wanted Umar at the time to settle because there were differences at the time. Some people wanted to elect their own, and in order to settle it, they said, no, he has to come from Quraysh. But yes, there are egalitarian people in the Islamic traditions who actually decided why should it be from the Quraysh tribe. The guerrilla warfare, yes, plus. If we think about the Islamic State simply as guerrilla warfare, how do we account for the foreign fighters? This is an element that is different. So it's guerrilla warfare. You probably know better than me on this, but the foreign fighter element is an addition to guerrilla warfare. On the secular order, ultimately, if you want to think in terms of, and I'm going to treat this as I felt that I probably misused Foucault, and I didn't, but that was not my intention. I just was going to use language that he used, and I felt that I needed to acknowledge him. But in terms of the caliph is supposed to be a secular figure in the Islamic tradition. And if we think about the history of the Islamic tradition, the caliph was supposed to be, did not have the authority over religious orthodoxy. It was the religious scholars who had the authority over religious orthodoxy. So in some respects, yes, there is the religious, the secular figure as in the body of the caliph. No. The source of law is already decided. It's been revealed. Settled.
And finally, you've done the endless spiral. That's great. Well, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. I think we learned a huge amount. Thank you all for coming.